They lowered their weapons too soon, not because they were kind, not because they were merciful, but because they believed the situation was already finished. The Americans stood in the open yard, surrounded by snow, stone walls, and men who had decided he was no longer a problem. The air smelled of cold metal and smoke. Boots pressed deep into the ground where soldiers had shifted their weight, relaxed their stance, loosened their grip. Moments earlier, this place had been loud. Shouting, orders, movement in every direction. Now there was a strange calm, the kind that appears when people believe the dangerous part is over. German soldiers filled the space around him, not rushing, not panicked, organized, confident. They had rifles, submachine guns, numbers, everything they needed. The American had none of that. His posture alone told the story they wanted to believe. Standing still. Hands not raised, but not aggressive either. No sudden movements. Behind him, 4 Americans knelt in the snow. Their hands were locked behind their heads. Their weapons lay scattered nearby, deliberately placed just out of reach. Their faces showed discipline, not hope. They were waiting for instructions they already expected. The Germans read the scene exactly the way they wanted to. This was control. An officer stepped forward. He wasn't shouting now. There was no need. His submachine gun was held low, casual, its barrel resting against the American's stomach like punctuation at the end of a sentence. He spoke briefly in German, sharp but an order, not a threat. The officer believed the hardest part was already done. Around them, rifles dipped slightly, fingers loosened, shoulders dropped. Soldiers shifted their feet, redistributing weight from alert stances into something more comfortable. Some glanced away, scanning the yard, already thinking about what came next. That was the mistake. The American noticed it immediately, not consciously, instinctively. He felt the pressure change in the space around him. The subtle shift that happens when attention drifts. He had lived long enough in combat to recognize it. They were no longer watching him. They were watching the moment after him. He didn't speak. He didn't move yet. He let the silence stretch, let the assumption harden. The officer's grip on the weapon relaxed, just a fraction. Enough to be felt, not enough to be noticed by anyone who wasn't looking for it. Someone behind the officer lowered his rifle fully, barrel pointing toward the ground. Another soldier adjusted his gloves. A third turned his head slightly, distracted by noise from the far end of the village. Control was leaking out of the scene, one small action at a time. The American's breath fogged in front of his face. He stared straight ahead, expression unreadable. If fear was there, it stayed buried. If calculation was happening, it stayed hidden. To the Germans, he looked like a man waiting for orders. They thought he was waiting to be finished. The officer spoke again, shorter this time. Impatient. He expected compliance now. Expected the final confirmation that the situation had resolved exactly as planned. The American laughed. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Just enough to be wrong. The sound cut through the yard like a snapped wire. Heads turned. Brows tightened. The officer stiffened, confused more than angry. That single sound didn't belong in the structure they had built around the moment. The laughter stopped as quickly as it started. Silence rushed back in, heavier than before. The officer leaned in slightly, irritation replacing certainty. He raised the weapon a little higher, ready to end the interruption. Around them, soldiers hesitated, unsure whether to react or wait. That hesitation spread. The American moved, not fast, not yet. His hands shifted just enough to register, slow and deliberate. The kind of movement that suggested compliance rather than resistance. The officer watched closely, convinced this was surrender, finally arriving. The surrounding soldiers relaxed further, convinced the interruption had passed. Weapons dipped another inch. Attention narrowed. The American's hand closed around the grip of his submachine gun. The moment shattered. The weapon came up in a blur. The first burst of fire tore through the quiet. So close, it sounded more like tearing fabric than gunshots. The officer collapsed before his mind could catch up to his body. Shock rippled outward. For a fraction of a second, no one reacted. Training lagged behind disbelief. This wasn't how the moment was supposed to end. Then everything happened at once. The American pivoted, firing into the nearest cluster of soldiers, his voice cutting through the chaos as he shouted for his men. The kneeling Americans surged forward, grabbing weapons from the snow, rolling, rising, moving with desperation and muscle memory. The Germans scrambled to respond, but the rhythm was gone. Orders collided. Weapons came up too late. Some fired wildly. Some froze. Some dropped their rifles entirely. Instinct overriding discipline. The yard filled with noise, smoke, and confusion. Snow exploded under boots and bullets. Men shouted in panic, in anger, in disbelief. The American kept moving, never staying in one place, denying the enemy the chance to recover control. The fight was brutal and fast. When it ended, the silence felt unreal. Bodies lay scattered across the yard. Wounded men cried out. Survivors stood rigid, hands raised, eyes wide with the realization of how quickly certainty had betrayed them. The Americans were standing again, weapons ready, breathing hard, alive. It hadn't happened because they were stronger. It hadn't happened because they were smarter. It happened because someone believed the danger was gone before it actually was. They lowered their weapons too soon. And in war, that is sometimes the only mistake you never get to correct. The yard didn't celebrate its new silence. It absorbed Italiano. Smoke drifted low over the snow, thin and bitter, curling around boots and broken lines of footprints. Men moved cautiously now, every step deliberate, every glance sharp. No one trusted stillness anymore. The Americans spread out, covering angles that minutes earlier hadn't seemed to matter. Rifles stayed shouldered, fingers stayed close to triggers. The prisoners were disarmed again, this time properly. Hands were bound, weapons were kicked far out of reach. Guards were doubled. Nobody complained about the extra caution. What had just happened had burned a lesson into everyone present. Certainty was dangerous. The American at the center of it all stood quietly as the scene reset around him. Adrenaline drained away, leaving a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. His hands shook, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but he felt it. The body's delayed reaction to surviving something it hadn't expected to survive. Men looked at him differently now. Not with celebration, with recalibration. A few minutes earlier, he had been part of the background. Another soldier waiting for the next order. Now, without trying, he had forced everyone to rethink what moments like that actually meant. He didn't explain himself. He didn't need to. Nothing he could say would be clearer than what they had seen. Orders came down to finish securing the village before nightfall. The Americans moved out, methodical and alert, clearing the last pockets of resistance. What might have been a messy counterattack never materialized. Whatever plan the Germans had been forming died the instant control slipped from their hands. By the time darkness settled, fires burned behind shuttered windows. Guards stood watch in pairs. The wounded were treated. The dead were covered. War returned to its familiar rhythm of exhaustion and waiting. Later, when reports were written, the language struggled to keep up with reality. Words like engagement and contact felt inadequate. Officers asked the same questions from different angles, trying to pin down a sequence that still felt unstable in memory. Each account agreed on the same thing. There had been a moment when everything should have ended and didn't. The story traveled quietly at first, passed in low voices between men who understood the weight of it. It wasn't told as a boast. It was told as a warning. Don't assume. Don't relax early. Don't decide a man is finished just because he looks like he should be. The American didn't correct anyone's version. He didn't polish the edges or strip them away. He went back to doing his job. The war still had work for him. So did the people beside him. When the fighting finally ended months later, that moment stayed. Not as a highlight, but as a reference point. Something that came up in quieter conversations, usually late at night, when men tried to make sense of how thin the line between control and chaos really was. Years afterward, people would analyze moments like this with distance and structure. They would talk about psychology, about initiative, about dominance and momentum. All of it would be true, in its way, but it would miss the simplest part. Nothing dramatic changed in that yard until the tension did. The Germans hadn't been outmatched. They hadn't been ambushed. They hadn't been tricked by superior force. They had made a decision small, reasonable. Human 2 relaxed for a second. That second was enough. Wars aren't always decided by who has more weapons or better plans. Sometimes they turn on who keeps watching when everyone else looks away, on who understands that the most dangerous moment isn't when guns are raised, but when they start to lower. They lowered their weapons too soon, and the war reminded them, without hesitation, what that costs.